The Vancouver Sun, from where Bob retired from as a reporter. Kim?
Hey, it's a real honor to get to speak about Bob and how I got to know him as a journalist at the paper, especially when hearing all these amazing stories. And one thing that really occurred to me is while he was working on all these underground papers and doing all this activism that you've been hearing about here, he was a full-time employee at the paper. And needless to say, management wouldn't have been happy if they knew about a lot of this stuff, right? So, it just sort of blows your mind to think like, oh my God, in the era of social media, you could not get away with the kind of stuff that he was doing back then, right? So he was a wonderful mentor to all of us, and honestly, he changed my life very profoundly. I started there. I'm already having electronic problems here with my little thing. I started at the paper in May of '84 as a summer staffer. Back then, there were, and people in this audience who worked at Pack Press, as we called it, can attest to this. There were so many staff members and reporters, probably 10 times more than there are today, that there weren't enough desks in the newsroom, right? So we were told as these summer staffers, go in, find a metal desk, sit down, and start doing your work, right? And, because people work night shifts, we had people there around the clock, right? Again, unlike now. And so I went in, I took one of these metal desks. It was so intimidating, right? You're, right out of J school, you got a summer job. This guy comes over, he goes, you're in my desk. And it was Bob, right? And I'm like, oh, they told me I could sit here. So he goes, well, you better move, So I get up to go find another desk, and he goes, and here's the collective agreement, right? And you're a kid, you've never had a union job, you don't really even know what unions are. And I was like terrified. And I have to admit, he has refuted this story many times since, but it was exactly what happened, and I will never forget it. So this is May of '84. Well, literally within 4 or 5 days, he had a big front page story on the fact that, Jimmy Pattison and Expo 86 wouldn't let 3 nonprofits from the downtown east side build social housing that could be used temporarily during Expo. So, big page 1 story, and I'm like, wow, this is amazing. And that story in May of '84 had voices in it that wouldn't normally be quoted in the mainstream media at the time. So, again, as a young reporter, you looked at that and you saw, wow, this guy knows how to get people heard who don't normally get heard. And it was really amazing to see that as a young journalist. So I don't know how he picked out who his foot soldiers, Karn. Do you know how he picked out Francis, Jean? But I guess fairly quickly I became one of his foot soldiers. And what that meant was that, we have there's a city desk, right? There's a city editor. There were so many bosses back then. Most of them were British. Whatever, that's another story. There's an assignment editor. And, this is pre-internet. You'd go in and there'd be a cubby and you'd have little pieces of paper with your assignment for the day in it, right? But what you really had to do was check in with Bob, because he would have an unofficial assignment for you to do, right? So he would go around, and I don't know if bosses really knew this, and he would say, I think you should do this story, and tell you a story that he wanted you to do that was more important, more critical to the community than the one you were being assigned. But you couldn't tell them that, oh, well, Bob's told me to do this. Like, he was just another reporter, right? So what you had to do is then pretend that it was your idea. Right, and you had to then say, "Oh, I've got this other story; it's really good." And and so Bob was really controlling the newsroom, right? A large part of the newsroom, Bob was controlling. So Jean Kavanaugh, who worked there as well, said to me that she was in his desk on the night shift, because again, we had to share desks. Now there's probably 6 desks for every reporter, unfortunately. And that she would come in for her shift, and there would be a little note from Bob telling her what he thought she should do that night, right? So. This was really, because otherwise, why would this guy, who was such an activist, be working for this corporation, right? It was because he was really controlling the show, or controlling a big part of the show. And it even got to the point where we would sit down and strategize. What's the best way to get stories into the paper? Sunday afternoon, they have sort of the second string of editors, people that are reporters or have other jobs during the week. So you can tell them, this is important, it should go on page 1. I'm starting a storm, it's Bob, he's coming back. And so we literally plotted the week out to figure out the best way we could get these stories in the paper with the maximum amount of play, as we call it, like space, page one and everything. And honestly, it was, in retrospect, it was really something. I'm not sure that kind of stuff happens today, right? Anyway, so, and it was clear to me as a young reporter that Bob was just a powerful force, using journalism for social good. He became a mentor to me and many others. He single-handedly got the paper to stop using the expression Skid Row to describe the downtown east side. You know, he gave voices to so many people who had never been quoted in the mainstream media before. Muggs shared with me this week about how his stories about the Expo evictions took a real toll on him. I'm sure many of you will remember his coverage of Olaf Solheim, who lived at the Patricia on and off for more than 60 years before he was forced to move because of Expo, and he later starved to death. That story was picked up by newspapers around the world, and it wouldn't have been done if it wasn't for Bob Sarti. In 1988, he was the first reporter to learn that a Kingsway barber named Gilbert Jordan was suspected of killing women in the downtown east side by poisoning them with alcohol. And you have to think about this. It's hard to erase modern context, right? But, you know, there were women being murdered in obvious cases of murder, and their cases weren't really getting any attention. You know, these are women who maybe have addiction or living marginalized lives, and they're dying of alcohol poisoning. You know, so back then, for that to become a criminal investigation that led to a conviction of this barber of manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years in prison was really extraordinary. And Bob worked with a couple of our colleagues, Chris Rose and Kim Pemberton, to document this extraordinary situation in a series. And even though Bob was kind of, was he morally opposed to awards for journalism? He sort of said he was. But his name still got entered in a few competitions. Anyway, that series was just amazing. And it was nominated for every national and local media award at the time. He went on to do another incredible series on child poverty in BC with another reporter named Larry Penn. And I mean, I was just rereading these stories this week, right? I mean, you obviously remember them. But I was just struck at how in-depth they were and how they included so many voices of kids and parents from across the province. They traveled everywhere who were living in poverty. But like the stories I know Bob did, they also offered solutions, right? It's really easy for a journalist to identify a problem, you know, and quote people complaining about the problem. But Bob always took it a step further, and he encouraged us as younger reporters to try and offer that up as well, right? So, you know, that's just, that was just the thing about Bob. He didn't write a story for ego or to get on page one with a byline, right? It was always about trying to change something that was unfair or unjust, whether, you know, it was a big investigation or even just a small overnight story about one person who had a problem, and that problem could be resolved by a news story in the paper. And it was like that back then, and he resolved so many issues for so many people. And as has already been noted, you didn't just cover, obviously, the downtown east side. He wrote about and taught some of us to write about conditions in BC prisons and jails, environmental stories. He also got many of us involved in the union, because, like, we worked for Bob, right? He pushed young journalists, including me, eventually, to join the optional pension plan. I resisted it for many years, and it's one of the reasons I'm still working. But I did join eventually. When Bob could see all of us imagining that we would never need a pension because we weren't going to last in this place, he made it mandatory. He fought and got it bargained in negotiations, and it became mandatory as a condition of employment to join the pension plan. So there are many journalists with nice pensions who owe that to Bob Sarti. I was upset when Bob decided to take a buyout at the end of '98. You know, he was literally there in the newsroom every day to bounce ideas off of, to go in and challenge management when someone was being treated poorly, which people in here can attest that work there happened a lot. There was one case where he helped me, sort of. I was a delegate at the BC Fed convention the first time I'd been that, so, and everyone, of course, is the whole convention attacking the media. So I did my one little speech at the mic and said, look, could you differentiate and attack media owners and not media workers? I'm a media worker and I'm here, as your sister, right? And then I said, I don't blame, the pulp workers for the effluent that flows out into the Howe Sound from the pulp mill, so why should you blame media workers for the effluent that flows out in the community from the newspapers? It was general. It was a general comment. So in typical Vancouver Sun fashion, the Labour reporter quoted me in the story attacking the paper, and then the paper put a letter on my file for insulting them in public. So we were grieving it, and Bob goes in, and he's like, I didn't like his position on this. He goes, there's a charter of rights and freedom. She has the right to call this newspaper shit if she wants to call this newspaper shit, right? And I'm like, I don't think that's the angle I was looking for, right? Anyway, needless to say, they could see that this was going to be a pretty ugly and public arbitration, so they quietly removed the letter from my file, and I guess I have Bob to thank for that, right? I don't think I was ever a delegate again after that, quite honestly. Anyway, so he left, but he still continued to be a mentor and would often talk to me about what I was working on. He also forced me to rationalize the stories I was doing. When I went to start covering gang violence, Bob said, people are saying, why is Kim covering gang violence, right? And I thought, well, I'm really good at it, isn't that enough? But, he forced me to think about why this was important, right? I hadn't even thought about that myself. And here's Bob, in his post-journalism phase, still trying to push journalists to have a reason to be doing what they're doing. And I appreciate that. And I think about that every day. So we continued to be friends. I mean, some of you will know he was at my house when he had his stroke. And I found him, and it was very hard. But, he was still Bob. He made this amazing recovery the first year, and I thought we were going to get him back 100%. And then, he had other challenges, unfortunately. And everyone's talked about how remarkable Muggs is, and honestly, she is the most amazing woman, and I adore her. And I'm grateful to get to have known you better, Muggs, after Bob had a stroke, quite honestly, right? Because Bob was often the center of attention and was hanging out in our media circles. And when he was staying at my house, he never had a cell phone, right? He would kind of say, oh, can I use the phone? Yeah, of course. And you see him kind of go to the corner and face the wall. And he would call Muggs like several times a day. And I wasn't eavesdropping, I really wasn't, but, you could just hear like the quiet affection and adoration he had for her. And the fact that he really couldn't go 3 or 4 hours without talking to her. It was just amazing. And anyway, I am grateful to have known him as a colleague and a friend, and I will miss him forever. Thanks.